Every parent's worst nightmare became Cameron Voss's daily reality when his 8-year-old daughter lost the use of her legs. No amount of money could bring back the sound of Ava's footsteps racing through their home. Cameron was a tech billionaire who could buy anything except what mattered most. His daughter sat in a wheelchair while the world's best doctors shook their heads. Then he met Jake Rivera, a poor single dad who fixed prosthetics in a tiny garage. Jake had lost his own daughter years ago, but he still carried hope in his weathered hands. While Cameron's millions failed, Jake worked nights with basic tools and an old 3D printer. He saw something in Ava that expensive specialists missed. He treated her not as broken but as brave. And when the moment came for her first steps, everything changed. What happens when a father discovers that the greatest miracles come from the most unexpected places? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The 42nd floor of the Voss Technologies Tower had always been Cameron's sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around his corner office like a crystal shell, offering an unobstructed view of the city that never questioned his decisions. From this height, people looked like ants, problems appeared manageable, and solutions could be bought with the right amount of capital. But today, the thick manila folder on his mahogany desk mocked every dollar he'd ever earned. Cameron Voss had built his empire on predictable patterns, market analysis, risk assessment, strategic acquisitions. At 38, he commanded a tech conglomerate worth $12 billion. His algorithms could predict consumer behavior with 97% accuracy. His artificial intelligence systems could diagnose mechanical failures before they occurred. Yet the medical files scattered before him represented 8 months of failures that no amount of money could solve. Ava's file had grown thick enough to choke on. MRI scans, specialist consultations, experimental treatments, surgical evaluations. Each page a testament to medicine's limitations and his own helplessness. The finest neurologists in 3 countries had examined his daughter. Swiss clinics, German rehabilitation centers, American research hospitals, all had taken his money and offered the same devastating conclusion. The accident had stolen more than Ava's ability to walk. It had shattered Cameron's fundamental belief that every problem had a price tag. He remembered the moment with perfect, brutal clarity. October 13th, 3:47 in the afternoon. He'd been in a board meeting discussing quarterly projections when his phone buzzed with the call that split his life into before and after. Sarah, Ava's nanny, sobbing so hard her words came in fragments. Intersection, truck ran the light. Ambulance, please come now. The helicopter ride to the hospital felt longer than the years he'd spent building his fortune. Through the medical district's sterile hallways, past worried families and overworked staff, he'd found his 8-year-old daughter unconscious in a bed that seemed designed to swallow her whole. Tubes and wires connected her small body to machines that beeped with mechanical indifference. Her legs, which had carried her through ballet recitals and playground adventures, lay motionless beneath white sheets. Dr. Elizabeth Harrington, the city's most respected pediatric neurologist, had delivered the diagnosis with professional compassion that felt like a knife wrapped in velvet. The spinal cord injury is complete at the L1 level. We've consulted with colleagues internationally. I'm sorry, Mr. Voss, the damage is permanent. Permanent. The word had echoed in his mind like a death sentence. That night, Cameron had stood beside Ava's hospital bed and made a promise that would consume the next 8 months of their lives. He would find a way. Money opened doors that remained closed to ordinary families. Experimental treatments, cutting-edge research, breakthrough technologies. Somewhere in the vast landscape of medical innovation, a solution existed. He'd been wrong. Now, 18 floors above his office, Ava navigated their penthouse home with the quiet dignity that broke his heart daily. Their marble floors, once chosen for their elegant beauty, had become a cold, hard surface for wheelchair wheels. The spiral staircase to the 2nd floor, an architectural showpiece, now stood as a monument to everything she couldn't reach. Cameron closed the medical file and walked to the window. The city sprawled beneath him like a circuit board, all connected lines and pulsing lights. Somewhere down there, beyond the reach of his algorithms and market predictions, regular people lived regular lives. They worried about mortgage payments and grocery bills, not the failure of medical science to restore their child's mobility. His reflections stared back from the glass. Expensive suit, tired eyes. The kind of success that meant nothing when your daughter asked why she couldn't run anymore. At 38, Cameron had learned to speak the language of profit margins and strategic advantages. He could negotiate billion-dollar acquisitions and predict technological disruptions. But he'd never learned the words to explain to an 8-year-old why her legs wouldn't work. Across town, in a neighborhood where success was measured in smaller increments, Jake Rivera wiped grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades. His garage workshop occupied the corner of Maple and 3rd, squeezed between a laundromat and a diner that served the best coffee in a 6-block radius. The building's red brick facade had weathered 40 years of changing neighborhoods, and Jake's hand-painted sign, Rivera Prosthetics and Repair, had faded to the point where regular customers found him more by reputation than advertising. The workshop smelled of metal shavings and possibility. Workbenches lined the walls, crowded with tools that Jake had collected over 15 years of fixing broken things. A computer from 2018 hummed in the corner, connected to a 3D printer he'd assembled from salvaged parts and stubborn determination. This wasn't the sterile environment of medical device corporations or the gleaming laboratories where million-dollar research happened. This was where practical solutions were born from necessity and nurtured with patience. Jake was 34. Though his hands looked older and his eyes carried experiences that aged a man in ways that time couldn't measure. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic, learning to repair human bodies under conditions that would have sent civilian doctors running for safer ground. Those experiences had taught him that healing often happened in the most unlikely places, with the most basic tools when desperation met determination. After the military, he'd found himself drawn to prosthetics, not the high-tech versions that cost more than most people's houses, but the practical, accessible solutions that helped ordinary people reclaim their lives. His clients weren't wealthy. They were construction workers who'd lost fingers, elderly folks whose insurance covered basic replacements, children whose families stretched budgets to afford hope. The photograph tucked behind his computer monitor showed a gap-toothed girl with pigtails and a soccer ball under her arm. Mia had been 7 when the improvised explosive device took her life, along with 3 other soldiers in Jake's unit. He'd been 26, invincible, planning to teach her to drive when he got home. Instead, he'd come back to an empty house and a grief that felt large enough to drown in. Prosthetics had become his way of giving mobility back to others when he couldn't give life back to Mia. Every successfully fitted limb, every first step with a new device, every smile of accomplishment from a client learning to walk again. These moments stitched together a purpose that kept him moving forward. Jake's current project lay disassembled on his main workbench. A leg prosthetic for Maria Santos, a 43-year-old hotel housekeeper who'd lost her limb in a car accident similar to the one that had changed Ava Voss's life. Maria couldn't afford the $30,000 devices that insurance companies sometimes covered after months of appeals and denials. She needed something that worked, cost less than her monthly rent, and could handle the physical demands of cleaning hotel rooms. The solution Jake was crafting combined off-the-shelf components with custom-printed joints, designed specifically for Maria's gait and needs. It wouldn't win any design awards or appear in medical journals, but it would give Maria her job back, her independence, and the ability to chase her grandchildren around the playground. This was the mathematics Jake understood, not profit margins or market valuations, but the simple equation of mobility restored to lives that needed it. His workshop survived on word-of-mouth referrals, and the kind of customer loyalty that came from treating people as individuals rather than insurance claim numbers. He worked most evenings until well past 9, partly because complex fittings required time and patience, but mostly because the empty apartment upstairs felt too quiet. The workshop filled with the sounds of productive purpose, the whir of the 3D printer, the tap of hammer on metal, the satisfaction of components fitting together perfectly. Tonight, like most nights, Jake had no idea that across town, in a penthouse that cost more than his entire building, another father was staring into the darkness and wondering how to help his child walk again. Two men, separated by wealth and circumstance but connected by the particular heartbreak that comes with watching your child struggle with limitations that seem insurmountable. Cameron Voss had learned to move through the world with the confidence that came from being able to afford solutions. Jake Rivera had learned to move through the world with the patience that came from creating solutions where none had existed before. Neither man knew that within days, a broken prosthetic and a desperate search would bring them together in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about healing. Hope and the price of miracles. The city hummed around them both, one man 42 floors above the street, the other at ground level with his hands deep in the work of fixing broken things. Tomorrow would begin the chain of events that would teach them both that sometimes the most profound changes come not from what money can buy, but from what the human heart can build. The prosthetic leg snapped with a sound like breaking bone, echoing through the sterile halls of the Meridian Rehabilitation Center. Ava Voss had been attempting her daily walking exercise when the carbon fiber socket cracked along a stress line that had been building pressure for weeks. "Oh, honey," breathed Patricia Chen, Ava's physical therapist, as she knelt beside the wheelchair where Ava sat staring at her broken prosthetic with the kind of resignation that should never appear on an 8-year-old's face. The device had cost $47,000. It bore the logo of Heidelberg Medical Technologies, a German company that specialized in pediatric prosthetics for families wealthy enough to afford hope measured in carbon fiber and titanium. For 6 months, this particular prosthetic had represented Cameron's latest attempt to restore his daughter's mobility, another expensive gamble. Against the immutable reality of her condition, I felt it starting to give way yesterday, Ava said quietly, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone she'd developed when discussing the various failures her body had endured. It made a weird clicking sound when I stood up. Patricia examined the break with professional concern that couldn't quite hide her frustration. This was the third prosthetic failure in as many months. Each device came with promises of revolutionary design and cutting-edge materials. Yet none seemed capable of withstanding the simple desire of a child to walk normally. "We'll need to contact the manufacturer," Patricia said, though her tone suggested this conversation would follow a familiar script of warranty limitations and repair delays. In the meantime, I wait," Ava finished. "I know the routine." 20 minutes later, Sarah Mitchell, Cameron's executive assistant, was working through a list of prosthetic specialists with the methodical efficiency that had made her indispensable to Voss Technologies' daily operations. The Heidelberg facility was booked solid for 2 weeks. The Swiss clinic that had fitted Ava's previous device was closed for equipment upgrades. 3 other specialists were attending a conference in Tokyo. "Sir," Sarah said through the intercom, "I've contacted every major prosthetics facility within a 100-mile radius. The earliest appointment is 16 days out, and that's only for an assessment. Actual repairs could take another month." Cameron stared at the city below his office window, watching afternoon traffic move in predictable patterns while his daughter sat immobilized by another technological failure. 16 days. In 16 days, Ava would miss her friend Emma's birthday party, the school science fair she'd been preparing for, and the simple pleasure of walking through Central Park to feed the ducks, a ritual they'd maintained every Sunday since she'd been fitted. With her first prosthetic, "There has to be something sooner," he said. "Sir, I did find one possibility," Sarah's voice carried a note of hesitation that suggested she was about to present an option that fell below their usual standards. "There's a small prosthetics repair shop about 40 minutes from here. Rivera Prosthetics and Repair. They're not on our preferred provider list, and the facility appears to be quite modest, but they answered the phone and said they could see Miss Ava this afternoon." Cameron felt his jaw tighten. His daughter deserved the best medical care money could buy, not some back-alley shop run by someone who couldn't afford a listing in the medical directory. But the image of Ava sitting in her wheelchair, staring at her broken prosthetic with eyes that had grown too accustomed to disappointment, overrode his instinctive skepticism. "Set up the appointment," he said. An hour later, Cameron's black Tesla pulled into the gravel parking lot of Rivera Prosthetics and Repair. The building looked exactly as modest as Sarah had implied. Red brick, weathered by decades of weather, windows that needed cleaning, and a hand-painted sign that had seen better years. This was not the sterile marble and glass environment where they usually conducted Ava's medical business. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Cameron asked Sarah, who had insisted on accompanying them for this unusual venture into unfamiliar territory. Before Sarah could respond, the shop's front door opened, and a man emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. Jake Rivera was not what Cameron had expected. Tall and lean, with calloused hands and eyes that suggested he'd seen more of the world than most people ever would. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable with his own capabilities. "You must be Ava," Jake said, ignoring Cameron entirely and crouching down to eye level with the wheelchair. "I'm Jake. I hear your prosthetic decided to take an unscheduled break." Ava smiled, actually smiled, for the first time since the morning's breakdown. "It broke right in the middle of physical therapy. Made a sound like a tree branch snapping. That's frustrating," Jake said, and his tone carried a genuine understanding that made Cameron realize how often people spoke about Ava's condition rather than to Ava herself. "Mind if I take a look at what we're working with?" The interior of Jake's workshop challenged every assumption Cameron had formed about prosthetics facilities. Instead of the clinical sterility he associated with medical equipment, the space felt more like a craftsman's studio. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with tools and components in various stages of assembly. A computer hummed quietly in one corner, connected to a 3D printer that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and determination. "This is quite different from what we're used to," Cameron said, unable to keep a note of skepticism from his voice. "I imagine so," Jake replied, without defensiveness. "But different doesn't necessarily mean inferior." He helped Ava transfer from her wheelchair to a padded bench, then examined her broken prosthetic with the same careful attention that Cameron had seen from specialists charging 10 times Jake's hourly rate. Jake's hands moved over the device with practiced familiarity, testing joints and examining stress points with the thoroughness of someone who understood both the engineering and the human elements of prosthetic design. The socket cracked along a predictable failure line. Jake said after several minutes of silent examination, "This particular model has a design flaw that shows up after about 6 months of regular use. The manufacturer knows about it, but they haven't issued a recall because the failure rate falls within acceptable parameters." Cameron felt his jaw clench. "Acceptable to whom?" "Not to the people wearing the device," Jake said. "I can repair this, but honestly, the same stress point will probably fail again within a few months. The real solution would be a custom design that addresses your daughter's specific gait pattern and activity level." "How long would that take?" Ava asked, and Cameron noted that she was asking Jake directly rather than looking to him for translation, something that rarely happened with other medical professionals. "For the repair? About 2 hours. For a custom replacement?" Jake glanced at Cameron, then back to Ava. "That's a longer conversation." While Jake worked on the immediate repair, Ava explored his workshop with the curiosity she'd lost during months of sterile medical appointments. She asked questions about the 3D printer, examined prosthetic components in various stages of completion, and listened with genuine interest as Jake explained his design philosophy. Most prosthetics are designed by engineers who've never worn one, Jake said, adjusting a joint mechanism with practiced precision. They focus on materials science and manufacturing efficiency rather than how the device actually feels to the person using it. My approach is different. How? Ava asked. I start with what you want to be able to do, then figure out how to make that possible. Instead of trying to make you adapt to the prosthetic, I make the prosthetic adapt to you. Cameron watched this interaction with growing fascination. In 8 months of medical consultations, no one had asked Ava what she wanted to do. They'd discussed her limitations, her prognosis, her physical therapy goals, but never her actual desires for mobility and activity. 2 hours later, Jake had completed the repair with materials that cost less than $50 and craftsmanship that seemed superior to the original manufacturing. When Ava stood and took a few tentative steps, the repaired prosthetic functioned smoothly, without the subtle clicking and pressure points that had plagued her for weeks. How do you feel? Jake asked. Better, Ava said, and Cameron realized she was telling the truth. It doesn't pinch anymore. As they prepared to leave, Jake handed Cameron a business card that looked like it had been printed at a neighborhood copy shop. If you decide you want to explore a custom solution, I'd be interested in working with Ava. She's got good instincts about what works and what doesn't. Driving home through evening traffic, Cameron found himself reconsidering assumptions he'd held about expertise, credentials, and the price of quality care. Jake Rivera's modest workshop had accomplished in 2 hours what months of expensive treatments had failed to achieve. It had restored Ava's confidence along with her mobility. Dad? Ava's voice came from the back seat, where she sat examining the business card Jake had given her. Yes, sweetheart. Can we go back there sometime? Not because anything's broken, but just to visit. Cameron glanced at her in the rear-view mirror, noting the spark of interest in her eyes that he hadn't seen since before the accident. Would you like that? Yeah, she said. I think Jake could build something really special if we gave him the chance. For the first time in 8 months, Cameron Voss found himself considering the possibility that the solution to his daughter's mobility might not come from the most expensive source, but from the most dedicated one. Jake's worn leather toolbox had traveled from the mountains of Afghanistan to the streets of Brooklyn, accumulating stories with every dent and scratch. The brass corners bore the patina of 15 years' worth of repairs, modifications, and small miracles performed with nothing more than steady hands and stubborn determination. 3 days after their first meeting, Ava convinced Cameron to return to Rivera Prosthetics for what she called just a quick adjustment. The repair Jake had performed was holding perfectly, but Ava had been thinking about his comment regarding custom solutions, and her 8-year-old mind had latched onto possibilities that expensive specialists had never offered. The alignment feels a little off when I go upstairs, she told Jake, though Cameron suspected this was more excuse than complaint. The truth was simpler. Ava had found something in Jake's workshop that she hadn't found in sterile medical facilities, someone who listened to her opinions about her own body. Jake welcomed them with the same unpretentious warmth he'd shown during their first visit. While he examined Ava's prosthetic, making minor adjustments with tools that looked older than some of Cameron's employees, he talked about his own experiences with adaptive equipment. In the field, we had to modify everything, Jake said, carefully adjusting the angle of Ava's knee joint. Standard medical supplies weren't designed for desert conditions or combat stress. We learned to improvise, to think about function over form, durability over appearance. Were you scared? Ava asked, with the direct honesty that adults had learned to avoid. Jake paused in his work, considering her question with the seriousness it deserved. Every day. But fear wasn't the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge was helping people believe they could still do the things that mattered to them, even if they had to do those things differently. As Jake worked, he shared stories that had nothing to do with medical procedures and everything to do with human resilience. He told Ava about Maria Santos, the hotel housekeeper who'd learned to salsa dance again with her new prosthetic. About Tommy Martinez, a construction worker who'd returned to building houses after losing his leg in an industrial accident. About elderly Mrs. Chen, who'd refused to let amputation stop her from tending her prize-winning garden. Each person is different, Jake explained, testing the flexibility of Ava's prosthetic joint. What works for Maria might not work for Tommy. What helps Mrs. Chen might not help you. That's why custom design matters more than expensive materials. Cameron found himself drawn into these conversations, despite his initial intention to simply observe. Jake's approach challenged the medical model that had dominated Ava's. Treatment, the assumption that patients should adapt to standardized solutions rather than solutions adapting to patients. The prosthetic you're wearing now, Jake said to Ava, was probably designed by someone who ran computer simulations and analyzed statistical data about pediatric gait patterns. That's not necessarily wrong, but it's incomplete. What's missing? Ava asked. You are, Jake said simply. Your specific height, weight, activity level, and most importantly, your goals. What do you want to be able to do? The question hung in the air with the weight of possibility. In 8 months of medical consultations, Cameron realized no one had asked Ava what she wanted to achieve. They'd focused on limitations, complications, and managing expectations rather than exploring potential. I want to run, Ava said without hesitation. Not fast necessarily, just run. And I want to climb the playground equipment at school without everyone watching to make sure I don't fall. And I want to walk on the beach without the sand getting stuck in all the joints. Jake nodded, as if these goals were perfectly reasonable rather than ambitious. Those are good goals. Achievable goals with the right design approach. Over the following weeks, Ava's visits to Jake's workshop became a regular occurrence. What started as prosthetic adjustments evolved into something that resembled collaborative engineering sessions. Jake would show Ava different components and materials, explaining how each element contributed to the overall function of the device. Ava, in turn, provided feedback about comfort, stability, and performance that was more detailed and useful than any clinical assessment. Cameron initially worried about the irregular nature of these visits. His corporate mind craved structured appointments, measurable progress, and documented outcomes. Jake's approach felt improvisational, almost casual, compared to the formal protocols they'd experienced at major medical centers. But the results spoke for themselves. Ava's confidence grew with each visit. She began volunteering to help Jake with simple tasks around the workshop, organizing components, cleaning tools, even assisting with basic measurements for other clients. The activities gave her a sense of purpose that formal physical therapy had never provided. She has good instincts, Jake told Cameron during one of their sessions. She understands intuitively how mechanical systems should feel and function. That's a gift. Jake's own story emerged gradually through these conversations. He'd enlisted in the army at 19. Driven by a desire to serve his country and provide medical care to soldiers in the field. Combat medicine had taught him to work under pressure with limited resources, to improvise solutions when standard procedures failed, and to focus on function over perfection. We had this saying in the field, Jake said, adjusting a component on his 3D printer while Ava watched with fascination. Perfect is the enemy of good enough to get home. Sometimes the best solution isn't the most elegant solution. It's the one that works when you need it to work. Cameron found this philosophy both foreign and compelling. His business success had been built on optimization, efficiency, and the relentless pursuit of perfect solutions. The idea that good enough could be superior to perfect challenged fundamental assumptions about problem solving that had guided his professional life. But watching Ava's progress, he began to understand Jake's perspective. The $47,000 prosthetic that had broken during physical therapy represented pursuit of technical perfection. Jake's repair, accomplished with basic materials and practical wisdom, had restored function without the complexity that created failure points. During their fourth visit, Jake broached the subject that had been building through their previous conversations. "I've been thinking about Ava's goals," he said, "and I believe I can design something that addresses her specific needs. It wouldn't be fancy, and it wouldn't impress other doctors, but it might give her the mobility she's looking for." Cameron felt his familiar skepticism rising. "What kind of timeline are we talking about? What would it cost?" Jake's response surprised him. "The timeline depends on how much testing and refinement we do. As for cost, materials would run about $800. My time is free if Ava's willing to be part of the design process." Free? Cameron couldn't hide his confusion. In his world, expertise came with premium pricing, and the most valuable services carried the highest fees. "This is what I do," Jake said simply. "This is why I got into prosthetics. Ava's case is interesting because she's young, active, and has specific goals. Working with her would teach me things that could help other clients." As they prepared to leave that evening, Ava turned to her father with an expression of quiet determination that reminded Cameron of her mother. "I want to try Jake's idea," she said. "I know the other doctors haven't been able to help much, but Jake listens to what I tell him about how things feel." That seems important. Driving home through Brooklyn traffic, Cameron reflected on the series of small revelations that had emerged from their visits to Jake's workshop. He'd built his fortune on the assumption that the best solutions required the largest investments. Jake was challenging that assumption with results that spoke louder than theories. That night, as Ava showed him sketches she'd made of prosthetic designs during their workshop visit, Cameron realized that his daughter had found something in Jake's cluttered garage that she'd never found in sterile medical facilities: agency in her own treatment. For the first time since the accident, Ava wasn't just a patient receiving care. She was a collaborator in her own recovery. And perhaps, Cameron thought, that collaboration might prove more valuable than all the expensive treatments money could buy. The 3D printer hummed with mechanical patience in the corner of Jake's workshop, its extruder head tracing precise patterns that would eventually become the foundation of Ava's custom prosthetic. The machine itself was a testament to Jake's philosophy of function over form, assembled from salvaged components, modified with handcrafted improvements, and calibrated through months of trial and error. "This is where the magic happens," Jake told Ava during their 5th visit to his workshop. "Well, not magic exactly, more like very precise plastic deposition." Guided by computer models and crossed fingers, Cameron watched his daughter study the printer with the intense concentration she usually reserved for particularly challenging homework problems. The device bore no resemblance to the sleek, million-dollar manufacturing equipment he'd seen in prosthetics factories. Jake's printer looked like it had been assembled by someone who understood machinery at a fundamental level, someone who could coax performance from components that had never been designed to work together. "How long does it take to print a prosthetic leg?" Ava asked, her face pressed close to the printer's transparent enclosure as she watched the extruder head build up layers of specialized polymer. "Depends on the complexity," Jake replied. "The socket I'm making for you, the part that fits around your residual limb, will take about 18 hours of print time. But that's just the beginning. After printing comes fitting, testing, adjustment, more testing, and probably a few complete redesigns." This timeline challenged Cameron's expectations in ways that went beyond simple impatience. His business operated on aggressive deadlines and measurable milestones. Jake's approach felt organic, almost experimental, as if the prosthetic would evolve through iteration rather than emerge from predetermined specifications. "The companies that made your previous prosthetics work from standardized models," Jake explained, pulling up computer files that showed detailed scans of Ava's residual limb. "They take measurements, select the closest pre-existing design, and modify it slightly to approximate a custom fit. It's efficient, but it's not truly personalized. What's different about your approach?" Cameron asked. Jake gestured toward his computer screen, which displayed a 3-dimensional model that had been built from dozens of photographs and measurements taken during Ava's previous visits. "I start with you, specifically you, and design everything around your actual anatomy, your movement patterns, and your goals. The prosthetic becomes an extension of your body rather than a medical device attached to your body. The distinction seemed subtle but significant. Cameron had spent months thinking about Ava's prosthetic as a piece of equipment that she wore, rather than as an integrated part of her physical system. Jake's perspective suggested a fundamentally different relationship between person and device. "Can I help design it?" Ava asked. "Not the medical parts, obviously, but maybe the appearance or some of the features." "Absolutely," Jake said. "In fact, I was hoping you'd want to be involved in the design process. You're the one who has to live with this thing every day. Your input is more valuable than any engineering textbook." Over the following weeks, the prosthetic design became a collaborative project that engaged Ava in ways that formal medical treatment never had. She tested different materials for comfort and durability, provided feedback on joint mechanisms, and even contributed aesthetic suggestions that Jake incorporated into the final design. Cameron initially struggled with the informal nature of this process. He was accustomed to medical treatments that followed established protocols, with clear phases of development and predictable outcomes. Jake's methodology felt more like artistic collaboration than clinical procedure, but the results were undeniable. Ava's engagement with her own treatment created a sense of ownership and optimism that had been absent during their expensive consultations with specialists. Instead of passively receiving care, she was actively participating in the creation of her own solution. "The psychological component is huge," Jake explained during one of their sessions. "When someone feels like a participant rather than a patient, their acceptance of the prosthetic improves dramatically. They're more likely to push their limits, more willing to work through adjustment periods, and more committed to the maintenance and care the device requires." The first prototype emerged from Jake's 3D printer after 3 weeks of design refinement. The socket looked unlike anything Cameron had seen in previous prosthetics, organic curves rather than industrial angles, with integrated ventilation channels and pressure distribution features that had been customized for Ava's specific anatomy. "It's beautiful," Ava said, running her fingers over the smooth surface that would soon become part of her daily life. Jake's modification of standard prosthetic components impressed Cameron, despite his initial skepticism. The knee joint incorporated elements from 3 different manufacturers, combined in ways that optimized performance for Ava's height, weight, and activity level. The ankle mechanism had been redesigned to provide better ground clearance during walking while maintaining the flexibility needed for activities like climbing playground equipment. "This isn't how prosthetics are typically manufactured," Cameron observed. "No, it's not," Jake agreed. "Most manufacturers focus on developing devices that work reasonably well for the largest number of users. I'm focused on developing a device that works exceptionally well for one specific user." The first fitting revealed both the promise and the challenges of Jake's approach. The socket fit better than any prosthetic Ava had worn, with none of the pressure points and friction areas that had plagued her previous devices. But the knee joint required adjustment, the alignment needed refinement, and the ankle mechanism responded differently than Jake had anticipated. Rather than viewing these issues as failures, Jake treated them as data points in an ongoing optimization process. He documented Ava's feedback, modified the design, and printed updated components with the patience of someone who understood that innovation required iteration. "In the medical device industry," Jake explained to Cameron, "there's enormous pressure to get designs right on the first try. Clinical trials, regulatory approval, manufacturing costs, everything pushes towards standardization and risk avoidance." "That seems reasonable," Cameron said. "It is reasonable from a business perspective, but it's not optimal from a patient perspective. Ava's needs are specific to Ava. Generic solutions will always be compromises through multiple fittings and adjustments." Cameron watched Jake refine the prosthetic with the meticulous attention of a craftsman creating a one-of-a-kind piece. Each modification addressed specific feedback Ava provided about comfort, performance, or aesthetic preferences. The process felt more like custom tailoring than medical device manufacturing. "How did you learn to do this?" Cameron asked during one of their sessions. "The combination of medical knowledge, engineering skills, and manufacturing capability. That's an unusual skill set." Jake paused in his work, considering the question with the same thoughtfulness he brought to prosthetic design. Military medicine teaches you to improvise solutions with whatever resources are available. Combat situations don't wait for proper equipment or ideal conditions. You learn to work with what you have, to modify and adapt, to prioritize function over everything else. And after the military, I spent a few years working for a large prosthetics manufacturer. Good company, talented engineers, but everything was designed by committee and optimized for mass production. I kept thinking about individual soldiers I'd treated, wondering if their long-term outcomes might have been better with more personalized solutions. The conversation revealed Jake's motivation in ways that pure technical discussion couldn't capture. His approach to prosthetics wasn't just about engineering, it was about honoring the individual, stories and specific needs of people who'd experienced profound physical changes. As the fourth week of development concluded, Ava's custom prosthetic had evolved through 7 iterations of testing and refinement. The device that emerged from this collaborative process bore little resemblance to the expensive, standardized prosthetics she'd worn previously. "I think we're ready for a real-world test," Jake announced, watching Ava walk smoothly across his workshop, wearing the latest version of her custom prosthetic. For the first time since her accident, Ava walked without the slight limp that had characterized her gait with previous devices. The custom socket distributed weight evenly. The modified knee joint responded naturally to her movement patterns, and the refined ankle mechanism provided stability without sacrificing flexibility. "How does it feel?" Jake asked. Ava took several more steps, testing the prosthetic's response to different movements. "It feels like part of me," she said, "instead of something attached to me." Cameron realized that this simple distinction represented everything Jake had been working toward, not just restoring Ava's mobility, but integrating that mobility seamlessly into her sense of self. The hospital discharge papers had yellowed slightly around the edges, 8 months of handling having left them soft and worn like old photographs. Cameron kept them in his desk drawer at the office, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps they served as a reminder of the moment when expensive medical care had reached its limits, when Dr. Harrington's compassionate voice had delivered a verdict that no amount of money could appeal. Tonight, alone in his office while the city sparkled 42 floors below, Cameron spread the discharge documents across his mahogany desk and read them again with the careful attention he usually reserved for merger contracts. The clinical language felt both precise and inadequate. Spinal cord injury, complete at L1 level, permanent paralysis of lower extremities. Neat categories that failed to capture the reality of watching your 8-year-old daughter navigate a world designed for people who could walk. The prognosis section contained a paragraph that had haunted him for months. Patient will require assistive mobility devices for life. Recommend pursuing acceptance-based therapy approaches rather than seeking restoration of function. In medical terminology, this meant stop hoping for a cure and start learning to live with limitations. But Jake Rivera's workshop had challenged that recommendation in ways that no expensive specialist had been willing to attempt. Cameron's phone buzzed with a text message from Ava at Jake's workshop. "New prosthetic working great. Can we stay for dinner? He's making spaghetti." The casual domesticity of that message would have been impossible to imagine 8 months ago. Ava's medical appointments had been scheduled weeks in advance, conducted in sterile environments, and followed by detailed reports that analyzed her condition without necessarily improving it. Jake's approach felt more like friendship than treatment, yet it had produced results that formal medicine hadn't achieved. 3 floors below Cameron's office, The Voss Technologies Board of Directors was concluding their monthly meeting without their CEO's presence. This was the third meeting Cameron had missed in 2 months, a pattern that had not gone unnoticed by investors who expected his personal attention to company operations. Richard Steinberg, the company's chief financial officer and Cameron's oldest business partner, had sent increasingly pointed messages about Cameron's distracted leadership style. The latest quarterly projections showed strong performance, but several strategic initiatives had stalled due to Cameron's reduced involvement in day-to-day operations. Cameron understood the concern. He'd built Voss Technologies on the principle of hands-on leadership, direct involvement in every major decision, and the kind of focused intensity that competitors found difficult to match. But since Ava's accident, maintaining that level of professional engagement felt impossible when his daughter's well-being required constant attention. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years developing algorithms that could predict market behavior and optimize business outcomes. Yet he'd been unable to predict that his daughter's healing might come from a humble garage workshop rather than prestigious medical centers. His desktop computer displayed the latest reports from Ava's previous prosthetic specialists. Heidelberg Medical Technologies had issued a technical bulletin about the socket failure that had brought them to Jake's workshop, acknowledging a manufacturing defect that affected 12% of devices in Ava's age category. The Swiss clinic had sent a follow-up proposal for an experimental treatment program costing $200,000, with no guarantee of improved outcomes. These communications felt increasingly irrelevant as Cameron watched his daughter flourish under Jake's unconventional care. The measured progress she'd achieved in Jake's workshop surpassed months of expensive therapy and cutting-edge treatments. Across town, Ava was learning to cook spaghetti with the focused determination she brought to all new challenges. Jake's apartment above the workshop was small but comfortable, filled with the kind of practical furniture that prioritized function over appearance. The kitchen smelled of garlic and fresh basil, and Ava stood on a step stool next to the stove, carefully stirring sauce under Jake's supervision. "The secret is patience," Jake was saying. "You can't rush good sauce. It has to develop flavor slowly." "Like prosthetics?" Ava asked, making the kind of connection that adults often missed. "Exactly like prosthetics," Jake laughed. "The best solutions take time to develop properly." For Jake, these dinners with Ava had become unexpected highlights in weeks that otherwise felt heavy with solitude. Since returning from his second deployment, he'd grown accustomed to eating alone, to the quiet apartment that echoed with memories of phone conversations with Mia that would never happen again. Ava's presence filled those spaces with the kind of energy that reminded Jake why he'd chosen prosthetics as his post-military career. Her progress with the custom device had been remarkable, but more importantly, her confidence had returned in ways that went beyond simple mobility improvement. "Jake," Ava said, carefully ladling sauce over pasta with the precision of someone who took cooking seriously, "can I ask you something personal?" "Sure, kiddo. What's on your mind? Do you ever get sad about your daughter?" The question hung in the kitchen air, like steam from the pasta pot. Jake set down his fork and considered how to respond to the kind of direct honesty that children offered without calculation. "Every day," he said finally. "But it's a different kind of sadness now than it was a few years ago. Less sharp, I suppose. More like missing someone who went on a very long trip. Do you think she would have liked me?" Ava asked. The question nearly broke Jake's heart, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "She would have loved you. Mia always gravitated toward people who were brave enough to try difficult things, like learning to walk again." "Like learning to walk again," Jake agreed. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, two people who understood something about loss and recovery that couldn't be easily explained to others. Finally, Ava spoke again. "I think helping me helps you remember her in a good way," she said, with the directness that consistently surprised the adults in her life. Jake realized that an 8-year-old had articulated something he'd been unable to express to himself. Working with Ava had indeed connected him to memories of Mia that felt warm rather than painful. Memories of teaching, learning, and the simple pleasure of watching someone master a new skill. Meanwhile, Cameron was experiencing his own revelation in the quiet of his office. He'd been reviewing financial reports when he came across a line item that stopped him cold. Prosthetic device expenses. 8 months, $437,000, nearly $500,000 spent on devices that had broken, failed to fit properly, or simply failed to provide the mobility they'd promised. The latest device from Heidelberg Medical Technologies alone had cost more than most people earned in a year. Yet it had lasted less than 6 months. Jake's custom prosthetic, built with $800 in materials and countless hours of personal attention, had outperformed every expensive alternative. This realization forced Cameron to confront assumptions about value that went beyond prosthetics and touched the core of how he'd approached problem-solving throughout his professional life. He'd always equated cost with quality, assuming that premium pricing reflected superior outcomes. Jake's workshop challenged that equation with results that spoke louder than marketing materials. His phone rang, interrupting these reflections. The caller ID showed Jake's number. "Cameron, it's Jake. I wanted to let you know that Ava's doing great with the new prosthetic, but I also wanted to discuss something else with you." "What's that?" "I'd like to start documenting Ava's progress more formally. Not for any medical publication or commercial purpose, but because I think what we're learning together could help other children in similar situations." "With your permission, of course." Cameron considered the request. Documentation meant data, measurements, objective analysis of outcomes, the kind of systematic approach he understood and valued. What kind of documentation? Gait analysis, comfort assessments, durability testing, user feedback. The goal would be to understand exactly why this design works better than previous approaches, so we can apply those lessons to help other children. The proposal appealed to Cameron's business instincts while honoring Jake's commitment to individual care. "I think that makes sense. Ava would probably enjoy being part of a research project, especially if it might help other kids." "There's one more thing," Jake said. "I've been thinking about expanding what I do here. Not growing into a big company, but maybe helping more families who can't afford the expensive alternatives. Documenting Ava's case could be the foundation for that kind of program." After ending the call, Cameron sat in his office considering the conversation's implications. Jake wasn't trying to commercialize his success with Ava or leverage their relationship into business opportunities. Instead, he was thinking about how to help more children access the kind of personalized care that had transformed his daughter's life. The contrast with Cameron's own approach to problem-solving was stark. His instinct had always been to scale successful solutions, to systematize and optimize for maximum efficiency and profit. Jake was thinking about replication without losing the personal attention that made his approach effective. That night, as Cameron finally left his office and drove through Brooklyn traffic toward Jake's workshop to pick up Ava, he found himself reassessing priorities that had seemed immutable just months earlier. The quarterly reports that had consumed his afternoon felt less urgent than ensuring his daughter's continued progress with her custom prosthetic. He arrived at Jake's workshop to find Ava demonstrating her improved walking ability with the pride of someone who had earned every step. The prosthetic moved with her body naturally, responding to her movements with the kind of seamless integration that expensive devices had never achieved. "Watch this, Dad," Ava called out, then proceeded to walk backwards, sideways, and even attempted a small skip that would have been impossible with her previous prosthetics. "That's incredible." "Sweetheart," Cameron said, and he meant it. The transformation went beyond mechanical improvement. Ava moved with confidence that had been absent for months. "Jake says we're ready to start testing it outdoors," Ava announced. "Real sidewalks, stairs, maybe even the playground at school." The prospect of his daughter returning to normal childhood activities filled Cameron with a mixture of hope and anxiety he hadn't experienced. Since the early days after her accident. Hope because the prosthetic clearly provided capabilities her previous devices had lacked. Anxiety because each step toward normalcy felt like a small miracle that could be taken away as easily as it had been granted. But watching Ava's enthusiasm and Jake's quiet confidence, Cameron realized that his fears were based on past experiences with medical solutions that had consistently disappointed. This felt different. Not because it was guaranteed to work, but because it had been built specifically for Ava by someone who understood her individual needs. "When do we start the outdoor testing?" Cameron asked. "Whenever Ava feels ready," Jake replied. "The prosthetic is mechanically sound, but confidence is just as important as engineering. She'll know when she's ready to take it into the world." Ava looked at both men with the kind of determination that reminded Cameron why he'd fallen in love with her mother. "I'm ready now," she said. "I've been ready for months. I just needed the right equipment." As they prepared to leave Jake's workshop that evening, Cameron found himself grateful for the broken prosthetic that had brought them here. What had seemed like another failure in a series of expensive disappointments had actually been the catalyst for the most significant progress his daughter had made since her accident. The medical discharge papers in his desk drawer had been wrong about acceptance-based therapy. Sometimes restoration of function was possible. It just required the right person with the right approach at the right time. The photograph, tucked behind Jake's computer monitor, had been taken on a sunny afternoon in Colorado Springs, just weeks before his second deployment to Afghanistan. Mia stood in their backyard wearing her soccer uniform, gap-toothed smile bright with the confidence of a 7-year-old who believed her daddy could fix anything that was broken in the world. Jake had carried that photo through 2 combat tours, dozens of medical emergencies, and the long journey from military service to civilian life. It lived behind his monitor now, just visible enough to remind him daily of why precision mattered in prosthetics work, why every fitting and adjustment deserved his complete attention, why helping others walk again felt like a form of prayer for someone who would never walk again. But today, as he watched Ava practice with her custom prosthetic in the small courtyard behind his workshop, Jake realized that his relationship with that photograph had begun to change. The grief that had once felt sharp enough to cut now carried a different quality, still present, always present, but tempered with something that felt like peace. "I think I'm ready for the playground test," Ava announced, walking confidently across the uneven concrete surface that Jake used for real-world testing scenarios. "The prosthetic feels stable, and I'm not getting any pressure points, even after wearing it for 3 hours. Cameron watched his daughter navigate the courtyard's challenges with growing amazement. 6 weeks of work with Jake had produced results that exceeded 8 months of expensive medical treatment. The custom prosthetic responded to Ava's movements with the kind of seamless integration he'd seen in demonstration videos, but never experienced in real life. "What exactly makes this design different?" Cameron asked Jake, genuinely curious about the technical innovations that had transformed his daughter's mobility. Jake gestured toward Ava's prosthetic, then pulled up computer files that showed the design evolution through multiple iterations. 3 main factors. First, the socket was designed specifically for Ava's residual limb shape and muscle patterns, not modified from a standard template. Second, the knee joint incorporates feedback from how Ava actually walks, not how statistical models suggest children her age should walk. Third, we optimized for her specific goals, playground activities, beach walks, running, rather than general ambulation. The technical explanation made sense to Cameron's engineering mind, but he suspected that Jake's personal investment in Ava's success contributed as much as design innovation. He'd observed Jake during their sessions, noting the careful attention to details that went beyond professional obligation. "There's something else I want to discuss with you," Jake said, his tone carrying a seriousness that made Cameron give him complete attention. "I've been thinking about Ava's case and how it might help other children. But I need to be honest about my own motivations. Cameron waited, recognizing that Jake was approaching something important. Working with Ava has helped me process some things about Mia, my daughter, that I hadn't been able to work through on my own. Jake's voice remained steady, but Cameron could hear the emotion underlying his words. Every time Ava achieves something new with her prosthetic, every time she gets excited about walking or running or climbing, it reminds me of what I loved about being a father. The admission hung between them with the weight of shared understanding. Cameron recognized the particular heartbreak. Jake was describing the way children's accomplishments could simultaneously bring joy and highlight what had been lost. Ava senses that connection too, Cameron said. She talks about you differently than she talks about other adults. More like family than like a medical professional. That's what I wanted to discuss, Jake continued. The line between professional care and personal investment has gotten blurred, and I want to make sure that's okay with you. Ava isn't just a client to me anymore. She's become someone I care about deeply, and I want to make sure my personal attachment to her success isn't compromising my professional judgment. Cameron considered Jake's concern with the kind of careful thought he applied to complex business decisions. The question touched on trust, boundaries, and the kind of care that couldn't be purchased with any amount of money. I think your personal investment in Ava's success is exactly why this approach has worked, Cameron said finally. The expensive specialists we consulted treated her condition as a technical problem to be solved. You treat Ava as a person whose life you want to improve. That distinction has made all the difference. Over the following weeks, this conversation seemed to liberate Jake, to deepen his commitment to Ava's progress. He began documenting not just technical specifications and performance metrics, but also Ava's emotional responses to different activities, her developing confidence with challenging movements, and her growing sense of agency in managing her own prosthetic care. Traditional prosthetics research focuses on mechanical outcomes, Jake explained to Cameron during one of their sessions. Gait efficiency, joint stability, energy expenditure. Those measurements are important, but they don't capture quality of life improvements or psychological benefits. What would you measure instead? Cameron asked. Things like willingness to attempt new activities, comfort in social situations, sense of independence, enthusiasm for physical challenges. The stuff that actually determines whether a prosthetic improves someone's life or just restores basic function. This holistic approach to prosthetic success appealed to Cameron's growing understanding that healing involved more than mechanical restoration. Ava's progress couldn't be measured only in walking speed or joint stability. It showed up in her eagerness to attend school, her willingness to participate in playground activities, and her renewed interest in planning future adventures. During their 7th week of working together, Jake shared the full story of his military service and Mia's death in ways he'd never discussed with clients or even close friends. The telling felt necessary, as if honoring Ava's progress required acknowledging the loss that had driven Jake toward prosthetics work. I was supposed to be home for Mia's 8th birthday, Jake said, adjusting components on Ava's prosthetic while she read quietly in the workshop's corner chair. The deployment was extended at the last minute, operational requirements that couldn't be postponed. I called her from Kandahar, promised I'd make it up to her when I got back. Cameron listened without interrupting, recognizing that Jake needed to tell this story completely. The IED hit our convoy 3 days before I was scheduled to fly home. I woke up in a field hospital in Germany, and the chaplain was there with news about casualties from a separate incident. Mia and 3 other family members had been killed in a car accident while I was unconscious in surgery. The workshop fell quiet except for the mechanical hum of the 3D printer and Ava's soft page turning. Jake continued his work on the prosthetic adjustment, his hands steady despite the emotion in his voice. For a long time, I blamed myself for not being there, for prioritizing military service over family time, for thinking that there would always be more opportunities to be the father she deserved. And now? Cameron asked gently. Jake glanced toward Ava, who was absorbed in her book but had probably heard every word of his story. Now I think that helping children like Ava is a way of honoring what I wanted to do for Mia. I can't give my daughter the life she deserved, but maybe I can help other children live the lives they deserve. From her corner chair, Ava looked up from her book with the kind of wisdom that sometimes appeared in children who'd faced their own challenges. "I think your daughter would be proud of what you're doing," she said simply. "And I think she'd like knowing that helping me helped you feel better about missing her." The conversation changed something fundamental in the dynamic between the three of them. What had begun as a professional relationship had evolved into something closer to family. Not the family any of them had planned, but the family that circumstances had created. As they prepared for Ava's first public test of her prosthetic at the school playground, Cameron realized that Jake's personal investment in his daughter's success had become mutual. Ava's progress was helping Jake heal from losses that formal grief counseling had never addressed. And Jake's dedication to Ava's mobility was teaching Cameron lessons about fatherhood that went far beyond prosthetic engineering. "Are you ready for tomorrow's playground test?" Jake asked Ava as they concluded their session. "I've been ready for months," Ava replied with characteristic directness. "But now I have the right equipment to prove it." The anonymous check arrived on a Tuesday morning, sliding under Jake's workshop door with the kind of timing that felt either coincidental or orchestrated. $25,000, drawn on Cameron's personal account, with a memo line that read simply, "For workshop expansion and equipment upgrades." Jake discovered it while opening the shop, nearly stepping on the envelope in his haste to unlock the door for Maria Santos, who had an early appointment for prosthetic adjustments before her housekeeping shift at the Marriott downtown. The check's amount exceeded Jake's annual income from prosthetics work, and its appearance coincided with mounting financial pressures that had kept him awake for the past 3 weeks. His landlord had been patient about the late rent, understanding that Jake's client base couldn't always pay full fees on schedule. But patience had limits, and those limits were approaching rapidly. The workshop's lease would expire in 60 days, with renewal requiring a substantial deposit that Jake simply didn't possess. Without the workshop, he couldn't continue his prosthetics practice. Without his practice, clients like Maria Santos would lose access to affordable adaptive equipment that insurance companies routinely denied. Jake stared at the check for several long minutes before Maria's gentle knock reminded him that other people's needs took precedence over his own financial crisis. He tucked the check into his desk drawer and focused on Maria's prosthetic adjustment, but the implications of Cameron's gesture weighed on his mind throughout the morning. By noon, Jake had worked himself into a state of frustrated gratitude that felt as complicated as any emotion he'd experienced since Mia's death. Cameron's generosity could solve immediate problems and enable workshop improvements that would benefit all of Jake's clients. But accepting such a substantial gift would fundamentally alter their relationship in ways that felt uncomfortable despite their growing friendship. When Cameron arrived that afternoon for Ava's regular session, Jake was ready for a conversation that had been building since the check's discovery. "We need to talk," Jake said, producing the check with the directness that characterized their interactions. "This is incredibly generous, but I can't accept it." Cameron's reaction surprised Jake with its lack of surprise. "I was wondering how long it would take you to bring this up. You knew I'd refuse?" "I hoped you'd consider it carefully before refusing," Cameron said. "I've done some research into your financial situation, not invasive research, just the kind of basic information that's publicly available. Your lease is up for renewal. You're behind on equipment payments, and your client base includes a lot of people who can't afford to pay full fees." Jake felt his jaw tighten with the kind of pride that had gotten him into trouble throughout his adult life. "My financial situation doesn't make me a charity case. I'm not offering charity," Cameron said calmly. "I'm offering partnership." The distinction mattered, but Jake wasn't sure he understood it completely. "What kind of partnership?" The kind where we combine your expertise with resources that can help more families access the kind of care Ava received. You've developed an approach to prosthetics that produces superior outcomes at a fraction of the cost of traditional methods. That approach could help hundreds of children if it had proper support. Before Jake could respond, Ava entered the conversation with the directness that both men had learned to expect from her. "Are you two arguing about money?" she asked, settling into the chair she'd claimed as her own during workshop visits. "We're discussing how to help more kids like you get prosthetics that actually work," Cameron explained. "And Jake doesn't want to take Dad's money because he thinks it would be like cheating," Ava added with 8-year-old logic that cut through adult complications. "It's not about cheating," Jake said, though he realized Ava had identified something important about his resistance. "It's about maintaining independence and professional integrity." "But if Dad's money helps more kids walk better, isn't that more important than professional integrity?" Ava asked. The question hung in the workshop air like sawdust, settling into places where it would be difficult to ignore. Jake had built his practice on the principle of self-reliance, partly because military training had emphasized individual capability, but mostly because accepting help felt like admitting failure. "Let me explain what I'm proposing," Cameron said. "Not a gift, not charity, but an actual business partnership. You continue doing exactly what you're doing, designing custom prosthetics, working with individual clients, maintaining the personal approach that makes your work effective. I provide funding for equipment, facility improvements, and expansion that allows you to help more people." "And what do you get out of this partnership?" Jake asked. "I get to see my daughter's experience replicated for other families," Cameron said. "I get to be part of something that actually solves problems instead of just generating profits. And honestly, I get to work with someone who's taught me more about problem solving in 2 months than I learned in 20 years of corporate consulting." Jake found himself considering the proposal despite his instinctive resistance to accepting help. The workshop's current limitations prevented him from taking new clients, forced him to ration materials, and restricted his ability to experiment with innovative designs. Cameron's support could eliminate those constraints without compromising the personalized approach that made his work effective. "There would have to be conditions," Jake said finally. "Such as? No interference with individual client relationships. No pressure to standardize treatments or speed up the design process. No expectation that this becomes a high-volume, high-profit operation." "Agreed," Cameron said without hesitation. "And if our partnership doesn't work out, you don't get to shut down the workshop or force me out. I keep doing what I'm doing, even if it means going back to the old financial constraints." Also agreed. Ava had been listening to this negotiation with the kind of attention she usually reserved for interesting technical problems. "Can I make a suggestion?" she asked. Both men turned to her with expressions that invited her input. "Why don't you try the partnership for 6 months and see how it goes? If Jake likes having better equipment and more space, and if Dad likes helping more kids, then you continue. If it doesn't work out, you go back to the way things were." The suggestion carried the practical wisdom that often emerged from children who hadn't learned to overcomplicate simple solutions. A trial period would allow both men to test the partnership without permanent commitments that might prove incompatible with their different approaches to business and life. "That seems reasonable," Cameron said. Jake felt his resistance wavering in the face of logic that served his client's interests better than his own pride. Maria Santos needed prosthetic upgrades that he couldn't afford to provide. 3 other clients were waiting for devices that required materials beyond his current budget. Expanding the workshop's capabilities would benefit people who had no other access to personalized prosthetic care. 6 months, Jake agreed finally. "But we document everything: costs, outcomes, client satisfaction, time requirements. At the end of 6 months, we evaluate whether this partnership actually improves the service I provide to clients." "Deal," Cameron said. extending his hand for a handshake that felt more significant than most contracts he'd signed. As they shook hands, Jake realized that accepting Cameron's partnership represented more than financial relief. It meant acknowledging that some problems were too large for individual solutions, that helping more people sometimes required swallowing pride and accepting collaboration. Ava applauded their handshake with genuine enthusiasm. "Now, can we please test my prosthetic at the playground? All this business talk is making me want to climb something." Her request refocused both men on the work that had brought them together, not theoretical discussions about partnership structures, but the practical business of helping a determined 8-year-old reclaim her mobility and independence. As they prepared for Ava's playground test, Jake found himself cautiously optimistic about the partnership's potential. Cameron's support could transform the workshop from a struggling practice into a sustainable operation that served families who couldn't afford traditional prosthetic care, but the real test wouldn't be financial statements or equipment upgrades. It would be whether their collaboration could maintain the personal attention and customized approach that made Jake's work effective. Success would be measured not in profit margins, but in the number of children who learned to walk, run, and climb with confidence restored. Ava's walking shoes sat on Jake's workbench like artifacts from a previous life. Size 3 Converse sneakers, purple with silver stars, purchased weeks before the accident for a school field trip that never happened. Cameron had found them in Ava's closet the night before, tucked behind the wheelchairs and adaptive equipment that had replaced the ordinary childhood accessories she'd outgrown through necessity rather than age. The shoes represented more than footwear. They symbolized the normal childhood activities that prosthetic devices were supposed to restore. But until now, no prosthetic had provided the stability and confidence that walking in regular shoes required. Expensive devices had demanded specialized footwear with modified soles and additional support features. Jake's custom prosthetic promised something different, the return to ordinary shoes for ordinary childhood activities. "Those are really my shoes?" Ava asked, running her fingers over the canvas material with the wonder of someone rediscovering a lost treasure. "They were," Jake said, carefully fitting the left shoe over her biological foot while adjusting the right shoe to accommodate her prosthetic ankle mechanism. "Today they get to be your shoes again." The fitting process required technical precision and emotional delicacy. Jake had modified the shoe's interior to work seamlessly with Ava's prosthetic foot, creating a system that would feel natural while providing the performance characteristics her activities demanded. The modifications were invisible, preserving the shoe's appearance while optimizing their function for someone learning to navigate the world on 2 different types of legs. Cameron watched this process with the kind of nervous anticipation he'd felt before major business presentations, but magnified by personal stakes that no corporate outcome could match. Today's test would determine whether months of collaboration had produced a prosthetic system capable of supporting his daughter's return to normal childhood activities. The plan they'd developed was deliberately gradual, first walking around Jake's workshop wearing the shoes, then moving to the outdoor courtyard for testing on uneven surfaces. Finally, if everything went well, a carefully supervised visit to the elementary school playground, where Ava hoped to rejoin her classmates during recess activities. "The prosthetic has performed well during all our technical tests," Jake said, making final adjustments to the shoe fit. "But there's always a difference between controlled testing and real-world use. We'll take it slow and see how everything feels." Ava's first steps in her regular shoes were tentative, her movements careful as she adapted to the different sensory feedback that came with conventional footwear. Jake had explained that the prosthetic's response would feel different with flexible soles, rather than the rigid footwear typically required for prosthetic use. "It feels weird," Ava said, after walking the length of Jake's workshop twice. "Not bad weird, just different weird. Like my feet are talking to each other in a new language." "That's normal," Jake assured her. "Your biological foot is getting different information from the ground, and your prosthetic foot is processing that information differently too. Your brain needs a few minutes to integrate the new feedback. Patterns. Cameron marveled at Jake's ability to explain complex biomechanical processes in terms that an 8-year-old could understand and apply to her own experience. This educational approach had characterized their entire collaboration, treating Ava as a partner in her own treatment rather than a passive recipient of medical care. After 20 minutes of indoor walking, they moved to the courtyard behind Jake's workshop. The space offered varied terrain, smooth concrete, textured surfaces, small steps, and uneven areas that simulated the challenges Ava would encounter in everyday environments. "Remember," Jake said, "if anything feels unstable or uncomfortable, we stop immediately. There's no rush here. We have all the time we need to get this right." But Ava's confidence grew with each step. The prosthetic responded smoothly to direction changes, maintained stability during stops and starts, and provided the kind of natural gait pattern that had eluded previous devices. Most importantly, it felt secure enough for Ava to stop thinking constantly about her mechanical leg and start thinking about where she wanted to go. "I think I'm ready for the playground," she announced, after successfully navigating the courtyard's challenges multiple times. "This feels like walking, not like managing a prosthetic." The distinction was crucial. Previous devices had demanded constant attention to mechanical considerations: joint alignment, weight distribution, balance compensation. Jake's custom prosthetic integrated with Ava's natural movement, patterns in ways that restored automatic locomotion rather than requiring conscious control of each step. But Cameron's excitement was tempered by anxiety about the social dimensions of playground testing. Ava hadn't participated in playground activities since her accident, partly because previous prosthetics couldn't handle the dynamic challenges of climbing equipment, but mostly because she'd grown self-conscious about being different from her classmates. "Are you sure you're ready for other kids to see you using the prosthetic?" Cameron asked. "There's no pressure to make this public until you're completely comfortable." "I've been ready for months," Ava replied with characteristic directness. "I just needed equipment that could keep up with what I wanted to do." During the drive to Riverside Elementary School, Jake reviewed safety protocols and emergency procedures with the kind of thoroughness that reflected his military medical training. They had backup equipment, communication plans, and clear criteria for stopping the test if any problems developed. But beneath the technical preparations, Jake was processing emotions that had nothing to do with prosthetic engineering. Watching Ava prepare for her return to normal childhood activities reminded him of similar moments with Mia: the anticipation of school events, the excitement of mastering new skills, the simple joy of childhood accomplishments. "You know," Jake said to Cameron as they parked outside the school, "regardless of how today goes, Ava has already achieved something remarkable. She's transformed from someone who saw her prosthetic as a limitation into someone who sees it as a tool for possibilities." Cameron understood what Jake meant. The child who sat in the car's back seat, adjusting her purple sneakers and planning her playground strategy, bore little resemblance to the resigned 8-year-old who'd accepted medical predictions about permanent limitations. The elementary school playground buzzed with the controlled chaos of afternoon recess. Children ran, climbed, and shouted with the unself-conscious energy that adults often envied but rarely remembered how to access. For Ava, this environment represented both opportunity and challenge, the chance to rejoin her peer group, but also the risk of public failure if her prosthetic couldn't handle playground demands. "There's Emma," Ava said, spotting her best friend near the swing set. "I told her I might be able to play today. If my new prosthetic worked well enough." Emma's reaction to Ava's arrival provided the kind of uncomplicated welcome that reminded adults why children often handle differences better than their parents. No dramatic announcements or careful explanations, just genuine pleasure at seeing a friend return to shared activities. "Ava, can you really play on the playground now?" Emma asked, her excitement matching Ava's own anticipation. Let's find out, Ava replied, walking toward the climbing structure with the determined confidence that had carried her through months of prosthetic development. Jake and Cameron positioned themselves strategically around the playground equipment, close enough to assist if needed, but far enough away to avoid making Ava's return feel like a medical demonstration. Other children began to notice Ava's presence, their reactions ranging from curious interest to matter-of-fact acceptance. "Watch this," Ava called to Emma, then proceeded to climb the rope ladder that had been impossible with previous prosthetics. The custom device's response to dynamic loading impressed even Jake, who had designed it specifically for this type of activity. But the real test came when Ava reached the playground's highest platform and faced the choice that would define her relationship with physical challenges going forward. She could take the easy route down via the standard slide, or she could attempt the rope descent that required coordination, strength, and trust in her prosthetics performance. Standing 20 feet above the playground surface, Ava looked down at the two men who had helped make this moment possible. Jake nodded with quiet confidence. Cameron held his breath with paternal anxiety that no amount of preparation could eliminate. "Here goes nothing," Ava announced, then grabbed the rope and began her descent with the kind of fearless determination that reminded everyone watching why children were often braver than adults. The intersection of 5th Avenue and Maple Street had never held particular significance for anyone in the Voss family until Jake suggested it as the location for Ava's first independent public walk. 3 blocks from the elementary school, surrounded by the kind of moderate foot traffic that would provide witnesses without creating overwhelming attention. The corner offered the perfect balance of public validation and manageable environment. Cameron arrived early, positioning himself across the street with the kind of strategic thinking he applied to business negotiations. From this vantage point, he could observe Ava's attempt without making her feel watched, could document the moment without interfering with its natural progression, could celebrate her success or provide support for any setbacks that might occur. The morning air carried the scent of coffee from the nearby diner and the sound of ordinary people beginning their ordinary days. Bus drivers, shop owners, early commuters, none of them aware that they were about to witness a milestone that had required months of collaboration, innovation, and hope to achieve. Jake and Ava approached from the opposite direction, walking slowly to allow final systems checks and confidence building. The custom prosthetic had performed flawlessly during playground testing the previous day, but today's challenge was different. This wasn't about climbing equipment or navigating controlled surfaces. This was about Ava walking independently through the world, demonstrating to herself and everyone else that her accident had not defined the limits of her capabilities. "How are you feeling?" Jake asked, stopping at the corner where they had planned to begin Ava's solo walk across the intersection. "Nervous," Ava admitted with characteristic honesty. "But good nervous, like before a school presentation that you're excited about." "That's exactly the right kind of nervous," Jake said. "It means you understand that this moment matters, but you're not afraid of it." A small crowd had begun to gather without any formal announcement or invitation. Emma and several classmates from school had somehow learned about Ava's planned walk and convinced parents to bring them for moral support. Mrs. Patterson from the diner had emerged from her kitchen to watch. 3 customers from Rivera Prosthetics, including Maria Santos, who had specifically requested time off from her housekeeping job to attend, had positioned themselves along the sidewalk with the pride of people witnessing a family member's graduation. "I didn't expect an audience," Ava said, noting the gathering crowd with a mixture of pleasure and apprehension. "Word gets around when someone's about to do something remarkable," Jake said. "But remember, you're not performing for them. You're walking for yourself. They're just lucky enough to get to watch." Cameron felt his heart racing with anticipation that exceeded anything he'd experienced during high-stakes business negotiations. Corporate deals could always be renegotiated if they went badly. This moment was singular, irreplaceable, and entirely beyond his ability to control or influence. Ava took her position at the corner, adjusting her purple sneakers with the methodical attention she'd developed for pre-activity equipment checks. The prosthetic felt solid and responsive. The custom socket distributed weight evenly, and the modified ankle joint provided the ground clearance and flexibility that Jake had promised during months of design development. "Ready?" Jake asked, stepping back to give Ava the space she needed for independent movement. "I've been ready for 8 months," Ava replied, then looked across the intersection toward her father with an expression that somehow combined determination, gratitude, and the kind of joy that comes from reclaimed possibilities. The traffic light changed, providing the pedestrian crossing signal that would govern Ava's walk. She stepped into the crosswalk with movements that looked natural despite the months of adaptation and training that had made them possible. The prosthetic responded smoothly to her gait pattern, maintaining stability as she navigated the street's slight incline and uneven asphalt surface. Halfway across the intersection, Ava paused and looked around with the wonder of someone seeing familiar surroundings from a new perspective. 8 months earlier, she had crossed this same intersection in her wheelchair, accepting that walking independently through public spaces was no longer part of her possible future. Today, she was proving that acceptance and possibility could coexist, that adapting to limitations didn't require abandoning dreams of transcending them. The gathered crowd watched in respectful silence, understanding intuitively that they were witnessing something private made public. Something personal that had larger implications for how they thought about healing, community, and the resilience of children who refused to be defined by their circumstances. Cameron found himself remembering the night after Ava's accident, when he'd stood beside her hospital bed and made promises about finding solutions that money could buy. The actual solution had required more than financial resources. It had demanded collaboration, patience, and the kind of trust that couldn't be purchased but had to be earned through consistent care and attention. "She's doing it," whispered Mrs. Patterson from the diner, her voice carrying the kind of awe that adults reserved for moments when children exceeded every reasonable expectation. But the real test was still ahead. Ava had reached the intersection's center, where a slight depression in the asphalt created the kind of uneven surface that had challenged her balance with previous prosthetics. Jake had prepared her for this moment during their workshop sessions, but real-world conditions never exactly matched controlled testing environments. The prosthetic's response to the terrain change impressed even Jake, who had designed it specifically for this type of challenge. The ankle joint compensated smoothly for the ground irregularity. The knee mechanism maintained stability during the adjustment, and Ava's gait remained natural despite the mechanical complexity required for seamless adaptation. "Look at her confidence," said Maria Santos to the woman standing next to her. 6 months ago, that little girl was afraid to walk across a flat floor. Now she's handling street surfaces like she's been doing it her whole life. The observation was accurate, but incomplete. Ava's confidence reflected more than prosthetic engineering. It demonstrated the psychological transformation that occurred when someone moved from accepting limitations to actively challenging them. Jake's technical innovation had provided the tools, but Ava's courage supplied the motivation that made independent mobility possible. As she approached the intersection's far corner, Ava began to smile with the kind of uninhibited joy that reminded everyone watching why children's accomplishments felt more meaningful than adult achievements. This wasn't just about walking across a street. This was about reclaiming agency, independence, and the simple pleasure of moving through the world on her own terms. The traffic light began its countdown sequence, indicating that pedestrian crossing time was nearly expired. Ava noticed the changing signal and responded, with a slight increase in pace that demonstrated both her comfort with the prosthetic and her practical understanding of urban navigation. Cameron held his breath as his daughter completed the final steps of her crossing, not because he doubted the prosthetic's performance, but because moments of triumph could be fragile. subject to last-second complications that could transform celebration into disappointment. But Ava reached the sidewalk with movements that looked effortless, despite the months of preparation they represented. She stepped onto the curb, turned toward her gathered supporters, and raised both arms in a victory gesture that would have been impossible from a wheelchair. The crowd's response was immediate and heartfelt. Applause that came from people who understood they had witnessed something rare and significant. Not just a successful prosthetic fitting, but a demonstration of resilience that challenged assumptions about limitation, adaptation, and the possibilities available to children who refused to accept reduced expectations. Ava's first independent steps carried her not just across the intersection, but across the invisible boundary between limitation and possibility that had defined her world for 8 months. As she walked toward her father with movements that looked natural, despite the technological complexity that made them possible, Cameron felt something break open inside his chest, a knot of worry and grief that had been tightening since the moment Dr. Harrington delivered her prognosis. "Dad!" Ava called out, her voice carrying across the street with the kind of pure happiness that reminded Cameron why he'd fallen in love with parenthood before business success had complicated his priorities. "Did you see? I walked the whole way without thinking about the prosthetic at all." The distinction was crucial. Previous devices had demanded constant mental attention to balance, joint alignment, and mechanical coordination. Jake's custom prosthetic had integrated with Ava's movement patterns so seamlessly that walking had become automatic. Again, a background process rather than a conscious effort. Requiring continuous focus, Cameron stepped into the street to meet his daughter halfway, abandoning the strategic observation position he'd maintained throughout her crossing. This moment demanded presence rather than documentation, participation rather than analysis. He reached Ava just as she began to run, actually run, with the abandoned joy of someone who had rediscovered a fundamental pleasure that circumstances had temporarily stolen. "Sweetheart, you're incredible," Cameron said, lifting Ava into a hug that somehow managed to avoid damaging the prosthetic while expressing 8 months of accumulated pride, relief, and love. "How does it feel?" "It feels like me again," Ava said, and Cameron realized she had articulated something he'd been unable to express throughout their journey with prosthetic development. The goal had never been simply to restore mobility. It had been to restore Ava's sense of herself as someone capable of normal childhood adventures. Jake approached them with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had solved a complex problem not for professional recognition, but for the simple pleasure of watching a determined child reclaim her possibilities. His expression carried none of the self-congratulation that might have been expected from someone whose innovation had produced such dramatic results. "The prosthetic performed exactly as designed," Jake said. "But honestly, the engineering was the easy part. Your courage made the real difference." The crowd that had gathered to witness Ava's crossing began to disperse, but not before offering the kind of spontaneous congratulations that reminded Cameron why community mattered more than individual achievement. Mrs. Patterson from the diner promised to make Ava's favorite pancakes whenever she wanted to celebrate. Emma and her classmates made plans for playground activities that had been impossible just days earlier. Maria Santos kissed Ava's forehead with the tenderness of someone who understood intimately what independent mobility meant to quality of life. But the moment that would stay with Cameron forever occurred when Ava turned to Jake with an expression of gratitude that transcended simple thanks. "You didn't just fix my leg," she said with 8-year-old directness that cut through adult complexity. "You helped me remember who I was before the accident." Jake's response surprised Cameron with its emotional honesty. Instead of deflecting credit or minimizing his contribution, he accepted Ava's gratitude with the grace of someone who understood that healing often required mutual vulnerability. "Working with you helped me remember some things about myself too," Jake said. "About why I became interested in prosthetics. about what it means to help people reclaim their lives after trauma, about how much courage it takes to trust that broken things can be made whole again. The conversation carried implications that went beyond prosthetic success. Cameron realized that his daughter's recovery had catalyzed healing in Jake that formal therapy or professional recognition might never have achieved. Helping Ava walk again had somehow enabled Jake to make peace with his inability to save his own daughter. As they prepared to leave the intersection where Ava had demonstrated her restored mobility, Cameron found himself reflecting on the assumptions about problem-solving that had guided his professional life. He'd approached his daughter's condition the way he approached business challenges, by identifying the most expensive solutions, hiring the most credentialed experts, and applying maximum resources until desired outcomes were achieved. Jake had challenged that methodology with results that spoke louder than theories. The solution to Ava's mobility had required technical innovation, but it had also demanded personal attention, collaborative design, and the kind of patient care that couldn't be purchased at any price. What happens now? Cameron asked as they walked away from the intersection where his daughter had proven that children's resilience could exceed adult expectations. Now Ava gets to be a kid again, Jake said. She goes to school, plays on playgrounds, argues with her friends, gets dirty, and occasionally breaks things that need to be fixed. The prosthetic becomes part of her normal life rather than the focus of her daily attention, and the prosthetic itself will require regular maintenance, periodic adjustments, and eventually replacement as Ava grows. But the design principles we've developed together can be applied to help other children. This was never just about solving one person's mobility challenge. It was about developing an approach that could help lots of kids reclaim their possibilities. Cameron understood that Jake was describing more than prosthetic manufacturing. He was outlining a philosophy of care that prioritized individual needs over standardized solutions, that valued collaboration over prescription, that measured success in quality of life rather than technical specifications. Walking home through Brooklyn streets that had witnessed his daughter's triumph, Cameron realized that the experience had transformed his own understanding of fatherhood, success, and the kinds of problems that money could and couldn't solve. The most important healing had occurred not in expensive medical facilities, but in a cluttered garage workshop where two men had discovered that children's courage could inspire adults to transcend their own limitations. "Dad," Ava said, skipping beside him with movements that looked effortless despite the sophisticated engineering that made them possible. "Can we go celebrate? I feel like I want to walk everywhere today. Anywhere you want to go," Cameron replied, and meant it completely. 3 months had passed since Ava's triumphant walk across 5th and Maple, and the partnership agreement between Cameron Voss and Jake Rivera had evolved into something neither man had anticipated when they'd shaken hands in the cluttered workshop. The document now rested in Cameron's desk drawer, next to Ava's original discharge papers, 2 pieces of paper that represented the before and after of his understanding about healing, hope, and the true meaning of wealth. Rivera Prosthetics and Repair had expanded into the adjacent building, but Jake had insisted on maintaining the workshop's essential character. New equipment hummed alongside the salvaged 3D printer that had produced Ava's first custom prosthetic. Additional workbenches provided space for increased client capacity, but each fitting area maintained the personal attention and collaborative atmosphere that made Jake's approach effective. On this particular Thursday afternoon, the expanded workshop buzzed with activity that would have been impossible before Cameron's partnership. Maria Santos brought her granddaughter for a consultation about pediatric prosthetics. 2 teenagers worked with Jake's newest associate, a recent engineering graduate who'd been drawn to the program by its focus on individual solutions rather than mass production. And in the corner where she'd claimed her usual chair, Ava helped a 6-year-old named Marcus test his new prosthetic leg while his parents watched with the kind of nervous hope that Cameron remembered from his own journey through adaptive. Equipment. The key is not thinking about it too much. Ava was explaining to Marcus with the authority of someone who'd mastered challenges that adults found daunting. Jake built this specifically for you, so it's going to work. You just have to trust it and trust yourself. Cameron observed this interaction from his position near the workshop's front door, marveling at his daughter's transformation from patient to mentor. The confident child instructing Marcus bore little resemblance to the resigned 8-year-old who'd accepted medical predictions about permanent limitations. Jake's prosthetic had restored more than mobility. It had returned Ava's sense of agency and her belief in possibilities beyond current circumstances. She's become quite the teacher, Jake said, joining Cameron near the door. 3 kids this month have made breakthrough progress after working with her. There's something about getting encouragement from another child that carries more weight than adult reassurance. Have you considered formalizing that peer support aspect? Cameron asked. Building it into the treatment protocol? Jake's response reflected the careful thinking he brought to all aspects of program development. I've thought about it, but I want to make sure we don't turn Ava's natural enthusiasm into a job. She helps other kids because she wants to, because she remembers how scary it was to trust a new prosthetic. If we formalize it too much, we might lose the spontaneous connection that makes her assistance effective. This conversation exemplified the ongoing negotiations between Cameron's business instincts and Jake's therapeutic wisdom. Over 3 months of partnership, they'd found ways to scale Jake's personalized approach without losing the individual attention that produced superior outcomes. But the balance required constant calibration. Ongoing discussion about when systematization helped and when it interfered with effective care. The financial aspects of their partnership had proven less complicated than either man had expected. Cameron's investment had eliminated the workshop's financial constraints without creating pressure for profit maximization. Jake could focus on client needs rather than billing requirements. Could experiment with innovative designs rather than defaulting to insurance-approved standard solutions. Could take time with difficult cases rather than rushing through appointments to maintain revenue targets. The numbers look good, Cameron said, reviewing the quarterly report that documented their program's impact. 17 children fitted with custom prosthetics, average satisfaction scores that exceed industry standards, and a waiting list that suggests we could expand further if we wanted to. And more importantly, Jake added, 17 kids who are walking, running, climbing, and participating in activities that seemed impossible when they first came here. The distinction between quantitative and qualitative success had become a recurring theme in their collaboration. Cameron's corporate background emphasized measurable outcomes, efficiency metrics, client throughput, cost-effectiveness ratios. Jake prioritized story-based evaluation, individual progress narratives, family satisfaction reports, long-term adaptation success. Their partnership worked because both approaches contributed essential elements to program effectiveness. Cameron's business acumen had created sustainable financial structures that allowed Jake to focus on clinical innovation. Jake's therapeutic expertise had produced outcomes that validated Cameron's investment while challenging his assumptions about how success should be measured. There's something I want to discuss with you, Jake said, guiding Cameron toward the quieter office space they'd created in the expanded facility. I've been thinking about the next phase of this program, about how we might help even more families access personalized prosthetic care. Cameron recognized Jake's tone as the one he used when approaching ideas that required careful consideration. What do you have in mind? Training programs for other prosthetists who want to learn this approach. Not franchise operations or standardized protocols, but educational workshops that teach the principles behind individualized care. We could share what we've learned with practitioners in other cities, help them develop similar programs in their communities. The proposal appealed to Cameron's strategic thinking while honoring Jake's commitment to widespread access rather than concentrated profit. Instead of expanding Rivera Prosthetics into multiple locations, They would expand the philosophy and methodology that made their approach effective. That could help hundreds of children, Cameron said, without requiring us to manage facilities we couldn't properly oversee. Exactly. Each program would be locally owned and operated, adapted to its community's specific needs, but guided by principles that we know produce good outcomes. As they discussed implementation details, Ava's laughter drifted from the workshop floor, where she was celebrating Marcus's successful completion of an obstacle course that had seemed impossible during his first visit. The sound reminded both men why their partnership mattered beyond financial considerations or professional recognition. "You know," Cameron said, "when Ava's accident first happened, I thought my job was to find the most expensive solution to her mobility challenges. I assumed that premium pricing reflected superior outcomes. And now," Jake asked, "now I understand that the best solutions aren't necessarily the most expensive ones. They're the ones that address individual needs with patience, attention, and genuine care about long-term outcomes." The conversation was interrupted by Ava's approach, her prosthetic carrying her smoothly across the workshop floor, with movements that looked natural, despite the technological sophistication they represented. "Dad." "Jake," she said with the kind of excited announcement that suggested she'd been thinking about something important. "I have an idea for the training program you were discussing." Both men turned their attention to Ava with expressions that invited her input. Over the months of collaboration, they'd learned that her perspective often contained insights that adult analysis missed. What if kids who've been successful with their prosthetics could be part of the training workshops? Not as teachers, exactly, but as examples of what's possible when someone gets the right kind of care and support. The suggestion carried the practical wisdom that characterized Ava's contributions to program development. Children learning from other children's success stories might approach their own challenges with greater optimism and determination. "That's a wonderful idea," Jake said. "Seeing other kids thriving with their prosthetics would probably encourage families more than any technical presentation we could offer." As afternoon moved toward evening, the workshop gradually emptied of clients and families, leaving Cameron, Jake, and Ava to reflect on the day's accomplishments and plan for future developments. The space felt peaceful in the settling light, filled with the satisfaction that came from meaningful work that improved people's lives. "I need to ask you something," Cameron said to Jake as they prepared to close the workshop for the day. "Are you happy with how this partnership has developed? Has it lived up to what you hoped it would accomplish?" Jake's response came without hesitation. "This partnership has exceeded every expectation I had when we started. We're helping more families, developing better solutions, and creating a model that other communities can adapt. But most importantly, we're proving that individualized care produces better outcomes than standardized approaches." "And personally?" Cameron pressed. "Has the work been fulfilling for you?" Jake glanced toward Ava, who was organizing prosthetic components with the methodical attention she brought to all tasks that mattered to her. "Working with Ava taught me that healing other people's children could help me make peace with losing my own daughter," Jake said quietly. "Every child who learns to walk again, every family that regains hope, every success story like Ava's, they don't replace what I lost, but they give meaning to the loss." As they locked the workshop and prepared to go their separate ways for the evening, Cameron realized that their partnership had accomplished something more significant than successful prosthetic fittings or sustainable business operations. It had demonstrated that the most profound changes often emerged from unlikely collaborations between people who brought different strengths to shared challenges. Walking home through Brooklyn's streets that had witnessed his daughter's triumph 3 months earlier, Cameron reflected on lessons that extended far beyond prosthetic engineering. He'd learned that wealth meant more than financial resources, that expertise came in forms that couldn't be credentialed, and that the most valuable solutions often emerged from patience and collaboration, rather than aggressive problem-solving. "Dad," Ava said, her prosthetic carrying her easily across sidewalks that had once seemed impossibly challenging. "Do you think we changed Jake's life as much as he changed ours?" The question demonstrated the kind of emotional intelligence that continued to surprise Cameron. "I think we all changed each other," he said. "That's what happens when people care enough to really pay attention to what someone else needs." As they reached their building, Cameron realized that the medical discharge papers in his desk drawer had been wrong about more than Ava's prognosis. They'd been wrong about the nature of healing itself, about the relationship between acceptance and possibility, about the kinds of miracles that became available when the right people found each other at the right time, with the right combination of hope and determination. Ava was walking, running, climbing and participating in life with the full engagement that childhood deserved. But more importantly, she was thriving as someone who understood that challenges could be overcome through collaboration, that limitations could be transcended through innovation, and that the greatest wealth came from relationships built on mutual care and shared commitment to each other's success.